but that person may not see things from the other's perspective. Might not see what these other groups are doing or the challenges that are in play. And so one of the biggest ways I think to overcome that challenge is to bring these different groups together and have them talk and have them share information, have them meet and build relationships. And the nonprofit that I currently work for or do a project for, that's working on the biotechnology solutions, they host these in-person meetings where they invite entrepreneurs and investors and scientists and policymakers and communicators and artists and all these people across these different disciplines to essentially come together and figure out different problems. And whether or not they come out with the solution, they're still building the relationships that allow those barriers to be broken down. And so I think that social element is very key. And because everybody really wants the same thing, kind of at the end of the day, they do want to help, but sometimes they may work in a silo or they may just not be aware of other sort of factors that people have to contend with.
Welcome to the Earth Mates podcast. Together, we explore how to find your path from climate anxiety to community action by asking, who are you? Because just like any relationship, that matters. So get ready to be raw and real, but also playful and silly with me, Chief Relationship Officer Amber Peoples, as we discover what's possible through the lens of the 5 Earth archetypes. Curiosity and subscription buttons highly encouraged. Welcome, friends, to the podcast today. Oftentimes at this point in the podcast, we tune into an element of nature. And so today, what I would like to share is that it is springtime here as we're recording this. And I wish there's an element of podcast that could include smells. Because right here, I have this vase of daffodils that come from a friend's farm. And so they come up right from the ground. And I was recently there swinging in a hammock and getting to watch these pop right out of the ground. And because of that, they have the most vibrant smell to them. And so I wish I could share that with all of you today beyond more than just words, but because words are what we have, I'm going to ask you to tune into what's around you right now. Like maybe it's not springtime. Maybe you're in the southern hemisphere and you're actually headed towards winter, or it is now June by the time you get around to hearing this, and it's full on towards the solstice. So whatever it is that's true for you in this moment, with the nature, the land, the air, the temperature that is around you, I'm going to ask you to tune into that while I silently count to 5 and give that opportunity. Thank you. Now, I'm delighted to introduce you to Network Earth Archetype, AJ Schlenger. We recently met through LinkedIn as I was learning about the Nexus group where he co-directs the Impact Accelerator. As a founder himself, Adam focuses on taking scientific innovation and emerging technology out of the lab and into direct applications that positively impact both people and the natural world. What I found so interesting about AJ in our conversation was how he combined 2 major roles that make up the network type: ecology and economy. That Greek root word eco stands for home and the systems that support it. So with his PhD on the wall and the equivalent of an MBA from real world experience, I'm excited to share our next conversation here on the podcast. So welcome, AJ. I'm curious to hear what your version of this story is.
Thank you. I really appreciate being here. I think you really captured things pretty well. I kind of started off just mainly only focusing on wildlife conservation, biology, and that side of things. And as I got sort of further along in my career, I realized it kind of wasn't enough to just look at a single species or a single environment. You really have to tie in what's going on with the climate, what's going on with the chemistry, and what's going on with other species, and really taking a holistic kind of ecosystem approach. And then even further past that, I kind of realized later on that a lot of the problems that we try to solve for in the natural sciences aren't natural problems at all. They're very much human issues. And so, in order to really find the solutions to those, you have to combine the natural side of thing with the human component of that and really tie those two systems together, understand their interactions, and use that understanding to solve problems. And that's kind of yeah where I'm at in my career.
Yeah. So I found that really interesting that for you, it sounded like there was either an aha moment or a continued distinction between what you call natural and what you call human. And I'm curious what that is for you, because I know that there's some folks, like when I talk with folks that are, let's say, in the fair housing realm, they'll part of their thing they'll often say is, well, humans are just as much as part of nature. So as we're dealing with
Mhm.
things like climate, we got to look at like people that have poor housing conditions and like
Mhm.
infested with mold or whatever. So I'm curious for you where that distinction is or where that connection is between natural and human.
Yeah, and so we're definitely 100% part of the system as well, but the way in which we interact with it is very different. Or in the wild, one species may eat another species or something like that. But for human systems, it's more we're connected a little bit more through economics and things like that. And so the cost of goods or the cost of services, that's kind of how we interact. And that's also a very large way in which we interact with natural systems, whether it's kind of extracting resources or sort of adding value to the health of an ecosystem or something like that. Usually, that connection or the way that we interact with those natural systems can be described through economics. And there's also cultural value, there's aesthetics and things like that. That's a little bit harder to create sort of a tangible value around, but it's not less important. And part of my work is really kind of combining those different types of value into yeah understanding where our place is in these different systems and how to manage them.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So we know like within a ecological cycle, everything has value, like the mushrooms that help the tree roots
Yeah.
and the
Hmm.
decomposing thing that feeds the vulture or whatever. So we know there's value, but within the human systems, um, we have perhaps just such a sophisticated form of calculating value, perhaps. Is
Hmm.
that maybe where you see some differences?
Yeah. And also just it's the way in which people kind of understand it and communicate it. For example, I come from the management world, and so let's say there's a decision maker, or policy maker, mayor or something, and he's got to make a decision on his desk, and he only has a certain amount of money, and one decision leads to maybe like a 50% increase in biodiversity. And on the other side, it's a dollar value that goes to, his constituents or something like that. It's really difficult to understand the value of that 50% increase in biodiversity versus being able to look at a budget sheet and cross things out. And so having the ability to communicate what that is to different people is really important, and economics kind of begins to do that, but it's not the whole complete picture. It's just enough to begin to make moves and sort of solve problems.
Yeah, so that ability to um there's an element of quantifying that
Hmm.
sounds like is helpful in that in the realm that in the perhaps more in the wild in wildlife, which is what you studied.
Hmm.
The sense of quantifying is more like, did I survive another year? Did I
Yeah.
finally feed in a time frame that I need? Did I breed in the time frame I need? And they're more
Hmm.
instinctual. And with the human element, it's more um quantifiable, I guess.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, exactly. And in the wild, you can go out there and measure how many of a certain species is there, or how big their habitat or something like that is. But yeah, the way in which humans interact with the world is very different. And yeah, one of the biggest challenges in solving those conservation issues is figuring out how to mesh those senses of value.
Yeah. And so I'm curious then, with that sense of meshing those types of values, I was just recently at an event where the Western Law Center, Western Environmental Law Center, they just brought on a deputy director about a year and a half ago that is an ecologist. She does have some policy work behind her, and kind of looking at this wildlife human interaction from a similar lens that you're talking about, but perhaps from more of a policy realm. And as they're looking at theories of change and how they're moving
Mhm.
forward with their ways of quantifying relationships in that way, they've developed this kind of theory of change that focuses on kinship. And this exchange process. And I'm curious, within this more economic realm that you focus on, have you found ways that are ways to verbalize this theory of change, that is helping people start to value things like biodiversity within a more numbers monetary system?
Yeah, and I love that idea of kinship, and I think that just represents an interaction that people have between each other, and you can describe our interactions with the environment in a very similar way. But there's already a lot of people beginning to do work on this because they're seeing how important it is to really sort of making large system scale shifts. And so the US government just released a report on nature based accounting and things like that. And so they're describing a number of different ways to go about this and how do you measure certain things. I also do a little bit of work with the EPA and on something that they call the Ecosystem Service Model Library. And so they have this big repository of all these different ecosystem models that measure these different types of services. And then people can go ahead and sort of use that for their own use or management projects or conservation or whatnot. And so people are tackling this from all different sides. There's things like carbon markets that are coming up. There's biodiversity credits that people are beginning to discuss. And so it's really finding ways to identify, what are our interactions with the environment? How do you measure that? And then how do you communicate that value in a way that other people can understand? And usually that just tends to be a dollar value. But again, that only captures so much of it. It's just the way that people understand it. And I think it does go back to measuring those interactions. And yeah, kinship is a good way to describe that.
Nice. So then with this ecology background, one of the things I remember in our last conversation that was really fascinating to me was as you were studying what was that? You were studying the ocean, but was there a specific animal or specific system you were focused on? I forget.
So I was studying entire ecosystems and how they work and understanding the energetics, and then how do you take that kind of holistic understanding and use that to get better management, problem solving, or natural resource management.
Okay. So then it's how to understand that system to be able to manage it better, because if we know the variables, we know different place of intervention points
Yep,
is what it sounds
exactly.
like. Okay.
Mhm.
And then one of the things that I thought was really interesting was as you were thinking about applying it to things outside of the ocean, whether that was, I think the terms you used were ant colony or like stock market, is you were looking at levels of scale. And I think that's really an interesting aspect of this network type is being able to see these nodules and their connections. And scale can mean a couple different things. Like maybe it's more connection points, maybe it's larger nodules, maybe it's more nodules. But I'm curious what scale means to you.
Yeah, so that's literally what I studied back in the day is taking that system science approach to how an ecosystem works and understanding what does that network look like and how much complexity equals ecosystem health and what is a ecosystem that's impacted by climate change or overfishing, what does that look like in terms of its network structure? And the cool part about this is that there's very universal rules that you can look at across different systems. And so, whether you are looking at an ant colony, whether you're looking at the stock market or Facebook or social network, or even just how the universe works, there's a lot of very general rules that you can apply from one to the other. And it does change depending on the scale. And so, from my background, you can start at the very small scale, which is maybe two different animals interacting with each other. And then you bump that up, and it's two different populations interacting with each other. And then you bump that up even further, and you have sort of an entire ecosystem and how they're all interacting. And there's different processes that play out at each of those different scales. And so, if you want to know how best to manage an ecosystem, you got to be able to plug into those different processes, understand how they work, and I think that same problem solving mentality can be applied to economics, or it can be applied to computer science, all these different things. And so, yeah, I think that network approach is very broadly applicable and super useful. And it's just pretty much just how the world works.
And so I'm curious then, because I do find that for you it does make sense in your brain to go the economics route, and for me I just find that root element interesting with the eco of ecology, the eco of economics,
Yeah.
and the sense that the word means home. We're either just studying our home or we're managing our home, and I'm curious for you, does that resonate for you?
100%. Yeah, we're studying our home, and we're studying how we interact with our home and how everything else that lives in our home interacts with each other. And that's, the core of it. And yeah, I never realized that both of those sort of terms meant home, but it makes complete sense and definitely resonates.
Cool. So then you focus on a variety of scale, and you do work on a wide range of projects from the EPA to, larger, more established organizations. But then it seems like a passion of yours is the startup community.
Hmm. Yeah,
I know
absolutely.
that you are a founder. You work with accelerators, which are all about helping startups get going. And so I'm curious what role in this realm of studying our home, managing our home, what do you think is the role of a startup?
So my personal interest in that is I just kind of have that entrepreneurial sort of mindset. I love building something from nothing. Unfortunately, you don't get much of a chance of that in the sciences or things like that. But it's just a very useful way of approaching things from a first principles kind of mentality. And in terms of startup and just that whole role of investing and things like that, we've reached a new sort of era where a lot of people are beginning to invest in nature-based solutions. And a lot of people are beginning to kind of see the current state of things in the world and are caring much more and are willing to put more resources into it. And that's creating a wide variety of new business opportunities and new ways to not only make money, but also do something good for the world at the same time. And personally, I don't think that you can really force change by tugging on people's heartstrings all the time. And sometimes you really have to tie a personal incentive or financial incentive to a nature positive solution so that people will get behind it and really move towards it. And so creating these new businesses, creating these new markets and these new sectors is a great way to really quickly scale a lot of the solutions that are needed for climate or ocean health, or all of the above. And yeah, startups play a very important role in that, and that they're sort of at the front lines, creating new ideas and moving new innovations out of the lab and into the real world. And it's a very exciting place to kind of be part of and help out.
Yeah, that's super fascinating. We've known climate is an issue now for a good 50 years,
Hmm.
especially from the science. We've known it, but culturally we've struggled with it.
Yeah.
And so, why do you think that we're at this phase where we are almost reliant on startups at this point to give us nature based solutions?
That is a very good question. And, I think there are much larger shifts. For example, a lot of government programs are coming out with new sort of research focuses and bringing new money into the different areas where it's needed. But a lot of those programs, like NOAA or EPA or DOE, they're kind of big ships and they're very slow to turn. And there's also a lot of regulatory policies in place that were made for a much older time for different sort of reasons, and it's slow to adapt to things. And because of that, it limits very large scale money and funding. The other big traditional investors are things like banks or really, really large companies, and they've been slower to get on board. And part of that tends to be, just where the solutions and the innovations are themselves. In order to get out of the lab and begin to get into field trials and more sort of commercial applications, you need other types of investment, whether it's philanthropy or grants or things like that. VC money can help a little bit, but it's just very targeted and can't push an entire field forward. And yeah, so it's been slow for the bigger players to move into it. Not 100% sure why. But it could just be the lack of potential for making a lot of money. The markets for a lot of these things are relatively small, but the creation of carbon markets is changing that, and that's moving a lot of big players into the space. And hopefully, things like biodiversity credits still kind of progress and are developed. I think there's a lot of challenges there, but those type of financial mechanisms will allow the bigger players to step in and kind of move the entire field forward.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting aspect for people who don't maybe necessarily think with a economic mindset is that with with the startups, you have the opportunity to perhaps niche into something and perhaps grow the market through that
Mhm.
process of showing success, both with the actual function of the product, whether it's carbon removal or 10 bazillion other helpful things. And then also people being like, oh, we want that. But I think that that concept of a market, to be able to move the big players is something that I think might be hard for people to understand. I'm wondering how do you approach it when you think about that difference between these niche places where perhaps startups can begin, but then um, the markets that are required to move the big organizations.
The way I think of it is if you have a good solution that's going to make a big difference and you're using that kind of private sector market approach, you want to make sure that there's a big audience for it or a big sort of set of consumers or a lot of people who are willing to sort of pay for whatever that is and build it. And that really is determined by the scale of what you're kind of looking at. For example, through the Nexus Accelerator, we're working with an organization called Lollyware, and they use seaweed to sort of extract specific compounds and turn that into things like alternative plastic straws or utensils or things like that. And so they were just originally going to use their straws for particular things, but then they actually approached some of the biggest plastics manufacturing companies in the country and figured out a way to take their little compounds, put them into pellets and into the machinery that already exists. And so suddenly they have access to this giant market that they didn't necessarily have before. And there's already a huge demand for those products. And because they were able to just essentially plug into it, it offers a whole lot more resources that go towards their solution and scales it that much faster. And so, really thinking about the end user or the end use of a product from a startup is really important in being able to achieve that scale. I hope that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, yeah, it definitely touches on it because I think what you may be feeling is that I almost felt divided in myself as I was asking the question, which is there's the side of developing the products, developing the markets, inserting like the example that you gave. It takes a certain personality and tenacity and all kinds of things to be entrepreneurial. And so for those that aren't, that more are perhaps employee orientated or go with the flow kind of person, and a lot of those people I think kind of do this emoji character of what can I do
Yeah,
when it
yeah,
comes
yeah.
to climate stuff. So there's the side too of being the market, being the one who's making choices with their purchases,
Yes.
and wondering how to use that power, I guess you could say, as well. So I think that's part of the reason I think
Yeah.
I the question was divided, was there was these two sides to it.
Yeah, and I think approaching it from the entrepreneurial way is a very niche kind of approach, and only certain people are kind of in that position to do so. But like you said, there's two parts: voting with your dollar, understanding what you're buying, where it's coming from, how it's made is huge. Voting with your vote is another thing, and understanding who's in office and what kind of policies they're going to create. I think that those types of things are the most amount of impact for what you can do individually, unless you're building a solution yourself. But also, I very much think that there's a systems approach to moving these solutions into the real world, and part of it is research. Part of it is working for a nonprofit and helping with early stage just support for these solutions. Another part of it is government and regulatory aspects and understanding how to better ease these solutions into new policies. There's all these different sides of the coin. There's marketing, there's storytelling, which is huge. It's something that scientists are notoriously just bad at. And so there's all these different roles for moving these things forward, and really just depends on what your skill set is and identifying how to put it in. But yeah, I think the amount of opportunity is kind of never ending if you really drill into it.
And I love that you absolutely walked into my archetypes without me prepping you.
Oh, good. Yeah, that's sweet.
Because that's kind of the concept of these five archetypes is this stretch, this spectrum of skill sets, and you hit on a couple of them. And I know with both Nexus and another project that you work on, I believe it's called the Far Away Project. One of the things that I've heard you say is that you're excited about these projects finding a way to redirect resources to new leadership who need it most. And so I'm wondering how that ties into this idea of, are these new leaders coming up with whole new ways of understanding how we can use these resources?
Yeah, I think so. And so I am currently board member for Faraway Project, and they're essentially a nonprofit that helps as initially being a fiscal sponsor for other impact organizations and nonprofits who are trying to build out their solution. But they also offer, services to help support their development, whether it's administrative or storytelling or PR or accounting or any of that, and really just help expand their impact. And they work with different individuals and different teams and help with leadership. And, depending on which team you work with, they all have their own unique sort of philosophy and approach. There's a lot of what are called sort of accelerators today, which is essentially organizations that kind of do the same thing. They just help businesses be better at their business and provide them connections and support, whether financial or just expert sort of advice. But they help definitely with leadership in that respect. And one of the most important parts of identifying successful kind of solution is the team around it and the support system that's there. And yeah, I can't say, to what extent specific philosophies work in a given area versus the other. It really depends. But yeah, I think that leadership and cultivating that culture around these solutions is just as important as the solution itself.
Yeah, that's really key. And you've touched a little bit at the beginning about this idea of the cultural aspect being just as valuable, but harder to quantify, harder to put on a spreadsheet,
Yeah.
but being a certain element. And one of the things that I wonder within this realm of ecology and economics and entrepreneurism is this idea of risk and failure. Because
Yeah.
I one of the things that I think is super interesting, kind of across the spectrum of archetypes, is within kind of a science realm, failure is not cool unless like you can replicate the failure over and over again and prove that something doesn't
Yes.
work.
Yeah.
But within kind of this more creative field or entrepreneur field where we're building something brand new, like it's kind of a necessary element. But yet, if you're having, investors support you, you can only really do that so much until they're like, this is a problem. So I'm wondering how you navigate that in the startup world.
God, yeah. I mean, it's such a core element of just human psychology as well. Because a lot of people will consider, oh, I didn't get what I wanted, or the thing I was trying to do didn't work. And therefore, that's a failure. I should stop and quit and just turn my attention somewhere else. But failure is part of the process. It's how you learn, it's how you test things, it's how you gain more information. There's several quotes that say fail early and often. It's kind of an essential component of just getting better at anything. And, it really depends on the scale you're talking about. Scientists tend to be very conservative, very risk averse. And it kind of makes sense because the mentality is like, I want to leave nature as it is and not mess with anything and screw it up. But we're already doing that everywhere, all over the place. And so there really isn't a pure baseline of nature anymore. And so, especially in like the management world or the nature based solutions, people are willing to take a little bit bigger of a risk in order to achieve these new things, and really sort of keep pace with the scale of change that's happening in the world. But within those perspectives, I think the ability to very quickly learn and adapt and change your process, which people may consider failure at each one of those little steps, is critical. And especially as an entrepreneur, you got to be able to roll with those punches and move forward and adapt very quickly. And just every time you fall off, just get up and wipe the dirt off and do it again. But government again is also very similar, and they're very risk averse in a lot of these things. So it depends who you talk to and the culture around those different groups, which sometimes will limit their speed and ability to very quickly move on things.
And one of the places where those intersect, this idea of kind of the risk adverse, slower moving government and quickly adapting entrepreneurship that we talked about in our last conversation, was you highlighted a key, really interesting pinch point between the two, which was like permitting and regulations.
Yes.
And how it's still just humans that are behind pushing that paper along, but changes in those humans or the systems that they're up against can cause permitting to slow down as slow as like 4 to 8 years is my memory of what you
Yeah.
said.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And I'm curious, how do you help? I'm assuming that's a big part of what you help startups navigate. So how do you navigate that?
There's a period I was working on sort of ocean-based solutions to decarbonization, and now kind of focusing on using biotechnology for conservation issues. And both those fields are hitting that bottleneck where they're trying to push these solutions forward, but there's a very stringent regulatory process. And some of those regulations, again, were written for pollutants that were used back in the 40s, but have no, overlap with what's going on today. And just people who have very different sort of perspectives and incentives within their organizations. And, um, you know, for example, a lot of those different things, solutions, whether it's in the ocean or biotechnology, they need field trials. And in order to get that happen, that permitting process can last up to anywhere from 2 all the way to 6 to 8 years. And if you're a startup and you have a very limited runway and overhead, you don't survive that. And so that's what they call the valley of death. And the permitting process is very much causing a lot of businesses to go under. And somebody told me that they were trying to do a field trial off of Hawaii for this renewable energy project. And there's one scientist who works in NOAA who studies a particular, or is responsible for a particular population of crabs, put the whole thing to a halt or a halt. And because that's his specialty, that's what he's dedicated his career, he or she, and has been studying, and that's their job, that's their responsibility. But that person may not see things from the other's perspective. They not might not see what these other groups are doing or the challenges that are in play. And so, one of the biggest ways I think to overcome that challenge is to bring these different groups together and have them talk and have them share information, have them meet and build relationships. And the nonprofit that I currently work for or do a project for, that's working on the biotechnology solutions, they host these in-person meetings where they invite entrepreneurs and investors and scientists and policymakers and communicators and artists and all these people across these different disciplines to essentially come together and figure out different problems. And whether or not they come out with the solution, they're still building the relationships that allow those barriers to be broken down. And so, I think that social element is very key. And because everybody really wants the same thing, kind of at the end of the day, they do want to help, but sometimes they may work in a silo or they may just not be aware of other sort of factors that people have to contend with. And yeah, that's a big part of it.
I think that's such an interesting insight from this viewpoint of the network archetype is you're seeing these different groups and you're seeing the nodes and you're seeing them trying to go in the
Yep.
same direction, but there's no connection points between them. There's no
Exactly.
lines that's bringing them together.
Exactly.
And do you think it's just because we're overworked and like trying to include a bunch of people is hard, or there's just not the systems in place to help, or is there something else that we can look at to help try to spark these conversations faster and more in depth?
Yeah, I'd say yes to all that and much more. It's such a complex thing. For example, different agencies or even different groups within a government agency will sometimes compete for money and for funding, and that causes them to separate into little silos. You see the same thing in academia, where somebody has to become an expert in their niche in order to get grant money, and because of that, it forces them to be very narrow focused or to see other scientists as competitors in some cases. That's one part, just the incentives that people kind of live by. Other parts of it are just institutional kind of barriers that have been in place for years that people just work in and never really think about and never kind of move past. But, having worked in academia and government and nonprofit, each one of those sectors has their own sets of strengths and their own sets of weaknesses. But when they're combined and bridges are built between them, and like you said, you're creating those connections between the different nodes, that's when you create a much stronger system and a much greater or more successful pipeline for moving the solutions into the real world to solve problems. But getting to that point is very complex and it's very case by case. and it takes a lot of work from a lot of different groups and is no easy challenge for sure.
We talked about kind of where is the line between nature and humanity, and what you just described about getting us back more in connection is I've heard the term rewilding, and it's not quite rewilding, but it almost has a similar vibe to it of remembering how, as a species, we should be more interconnected than we are.
Yeah.
And that's a style of remembering that, and that natural way of being that we have the option to return to.
Yep, I love that mentality, and that's kind of a core philosophy of problem solving, and that you bring together the groups or you learn the skill sets that are required to solve a problem, rather than just taking one skill and having that be your particular thing. And I think a core component of that is the collaborative nature, and it's sort of building these bridges and breaking down those barriers. And yeah, it's just not as widely sort of adopted as one might hope.
So now that we're in kind of this realm of talking about how these connection points between the nodes are essentially relationships, even though we didn't say that word
Yeah.
out loud. And so I'm curious, how do you help people establish, define, create this sense of relationship within these networks?
I wouldn't say it's necessarily like what I'm very good at doing, but I've seen it work in a lot of different situations. And one example I always go back to is there's a movie called Chasing Coral, and it really kind of shows the sort of big coral bleaching events that happened in the Great Barrier Reef. But on that, they have this one coral reef nerd, and he just gets super excited about everything, and he's really into it, and he just geeks out, and he's just got this passion that's infectious, and people can relate to that. And by creating that sort of relationship in a way that makes sense to other people, even if somebody lives on a farm in Iowa and has never seen a coral reef ever before, they can still see that aspect of human nature and really get into it. And it opens up a door into what the rest of the content is. And so I think storytelling is huge. The way that we share information, the way that we create these very kind of universal similarities between us and those kind of connections, honing in on those and really embracing them and putting them in the forefront is a really good way to do that. But it is still a big challenge, honestly.
So then, as we're developing these solutions, one of the pieces of science that just kind of blows my mind is because I do come from the more artistic, metaphorical realm of being in the world and thinking, and this idea of emergence has always been a part of my life. But I found myself studying the science of emergence recently, and found it really fascinating. So if we simplify it to two things, and they start to intersect or interact, and then all of a sudden we get to a point of chaos, and they're all over the place. If this is like
Yeah.
points on a chart, they're all over, they're wild. But then there's this interesting thing that my understanding of the science tells us is that at a certain point, those 2 points that are in chaotic relationship literally lift the pencil off the page and plop down in a whole nother location within the graph. And that's emergence, or perhaps even evolution as another word to describe it. And I'm curious to see if you see that happening within these realms that do tend to be more quantifiable and numbers based.
Yeah, I mean, I see that stuff everywhere because in the system science world, like anytime you have just a number of little individuals interacting with each other and you go upscales, it turns into that weird, crazy, complex patterns that form. And you see it in ecosystems, you see it in the way that humans form their cities, you see it in the way that countries are established, you see it in petri dishes, you see it in the universe. It's literally all over the place. And I think that component of it is really cool, and the way I guess it takes shape, in the context that you're saying, for example, climate change is causing a lot of issues that's upping that chaos factor, and it's causing people to interact in a variety of different ways to adapt and to adjust to it. And because of that, it's led to new systems or new patterns or new ways of behaving, like carbon markets or biodiversity credits is another example where these things are beginning to emerge as a response to those kind of chaotic forces, if you will. And yeah, it's very much in flux. And so, but I think you really nailed down the science of it and how that works. And yeah, it's kind of all around us.
Yeah. And one of the things that, in that moment, of course, that came to mind was we talked about scale earlier. And one of the things that I know is a fear that's become something that concerns people, including myself, is when we get to this level of scale, how do we know what version of it we're using is a legit solution? So like with carbon markets, we know that there's some that maybe they're a good idea, maybe they're not. So how does somebody that is a Joe Schmo off the street person be able to help suss out the true solutions that they want to support or use their own dollars to vote for?
I mean, that is one of the biggest um, issues or challenges that we're definitely facing because climate, the way that skill works is we may be able to put in a solution now, and there's a lag time of 10 to 20 years before the real sort of consequences of that or impacts are in place. And so that scale is different from the way that humans behave on kind of like a day-to-day basis. But even in terms of the suite of carbon solutions out there, there's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of uncertainty, and so there's a big push for MRV or monitoring, measurement, verification, and really trying to fully understand what the impacts of these different solutions are, how they're actually achieving those sort of goals over time or not. And unfortunately, when you put economics into things and there is that desire for profit as well, it brings in players who aren't necessarily acting in good faith. And so, for example, carbon markets, there's been a lot of distrust for companies coming in and claiming all these credits that really have no actual impact on things, but they're just jumping on the bandwagon and trying to make money off of it. And so that is unfortunately just an aspect of human nature. There's good people, there's bad people, there's gray and everything in between. And the difficulty is navigating that complexity and identifying what the real true solutions are. But just because it's hard doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing it and actively going in that direction. There's a ton of awesome, amazing people who are very firmly pushing in these different areas and making leaps and bounds. And so, yeah, especially from the outside, the people who are experts in it don't even necessarily know at the moment. They're just trying different solutions and they may not even know, like I said, for another 5 to 10 years before things actually go into effect. And even if somebody creates like an amazing solution, it may not have a huge impact until it's scaled up to be used across the world or something like that, versus being used in someone's backyard or even in just one country. And so, yeah, it's hard to navigate that.
I turn a lot to the social sciences, whether,
Mhm.
Emergence is a physicist, is a physical physicist, physics style, can't even say it.
Yep.
But then I look a lot at like behavior change theory, which is a social
Yeah.
science. And so I'm curious for you across that spectrum, what you see as what's helpful with science in both these realms of quantifiable solutions as well as perhaps once again going to that term cultural solutions.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think it really, so for example, economics, some people consider that more of like a social science and the kind of sort of forces behind behavioral change. And there's a lot of actually groups that specifically focus on behavioral economics and how do you get different large groups of people to adopt better practices or change different ways based off those different incentives. But also going back to, like I mentioned before, the storytelling aspects of it, the relationship building aspects of it are just as important because that kind of transfer of information or that transfer of a mentality or perspective is just as important as finding a specific science tech solution or even just creating a new financial market for something. And so it's all of those different systems working in conjunction with each other that actually leads to the biggest change. And so I think the social, the cultural aspect of it is just as important. There's indigenous groups that have been living with nature forever at this point, and they don't have that extractive perspective. So maybe we can take some of those aspects and put it into the broader culture and really learn from that. So that's a good example. And I think there's plenty more of how that broader behavioral change can be accomplished.
And so, as we talk about that broader behavior change, as we talk about relationships, a word that was interesting that popped for you in that, or at least popped for me in your answer to that last question was the word transfer. And that brings up to mind a phrase that I find really fascinating to both use as well as see different definitions of it. I think it became popular through Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is both an ecologist and an Indigenous person, and her attempt to kind of figure it out for herself as to how to combine the two, is this term reciprocal relationships. And so I'm curious where you see that interacting within this realm of both ecology and economy.
Yeah, it's kind of unique because when you get to like the real basics of what sort of system science is or network science is, it's really sort of the transfer of information between two different groups. That's like really what a connection is at the end of the day. And it can lead to just better, healthier. It's how you pass on solutions between different sort of groups and how, and you see this in like bacteria all the time. You know, they release their genetic material and they may have an adaptation that makes them really good for surviving in a different environment. And then they pass it on to all their buddies, and then they incorporate it into their own genome, and then suddenly the entire population is better at surviving in that specific place. And you know, vice versa. And I think that vice versa is really what leads to a very fast learning process, and that exchanging of ideas leads to kind of the most optimal pieces of information bubbling to the top, if you will.
Mm.
And yeah, so that reciprocity is very important in maintaining that.
Awesome. Well, I am noticing as I look at our little countdown clock that we are near the end of the hour. It went amazingly fast.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing all that you've shared. And there is one last question that I always love to spin at the end of these episodes.
Mhm.
And that kind of turns the table a bit and asks you, what's something you wish I would have asked? What did I miss? What did you want to talk about? It could have been science related. It could have been something about what you ate for breakfast. I don't know. Um, so more personal related, but what is it? What is it something that within this realm of talking about nature-based solutions and answering the question, what do I do, that you wish I would have touched on?
Man, that's a good question. We definitely tackled a lot of great stuff, and I really appreciate where the conversation went. Um, yeah, I think there's ways to learn about what's going on and what sort of solutions people are working towards, and yeah, maybe going into sort of there's little sort of demo events, or there's sort of what they call clusters. They have a bunch of ocean clusters these days, which bring together, whether you're a scientist or an investor, an entrepreneur, or a storyteller, they bring all these different groups together. And so maybe finding opportunities, or how to find opportunities to get more involved with those things, to hear different perspectives, to just be exposed to new information, to create those links, would have been a good thing to chat about. But yeah, happy to offer any sort of information offline and point people in the right direction.
Amazing. So yeah, it does sound like, we touched on that as a big piece of the puzzle that you felt is needed is how to connect these nodes, these silos. Knowing that you wished I would have asked more about there, is there a kind of a button you want to put on that thing for people that are listening as to how to get involved or why to get involved in that particular way?
Yeah, I wish I had very specific things to say, but there's such a broad array of different events and different groups and different things out there that it's not a one size fits all. And it depends on what your interests are and what your passions are. But I just say get out there, try to get more involved, try to meet new people, try to find chances to get that exposure.
Yeah, well, and what it actually brings to mind now that I heard your reflection on that was, I know somebody who coaches people who struggles to find like friends, and so one of her major recommendations for people is to find a book club.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah,
because then you
exactly.
don't have to worry about small talk. You know what you're going to be talking about. You put in the reps of seeing people on a continual basis. Because I guess the science says before you have a friend that you need to clock like 34 hours or something like that with them.
Yeah, really? Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, right? Kind of an interesting concept. And so what I'm hearing is something similar in these clusters that you're talking about is, go find those equivalent of the book clubs that are reading the types of books you're interested in, and then put in those hours, put in those times, and you'll have those structures that provide support to really feel like it's worth being there, and you're getting something out of it and providing something in return.
Absolutely. Strengthen your network, make those connections between the different nodes. And I think that leads to emergence of good solutions and good sort of steps. Absolutely.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, AJ, for your time and all the amazing stuff that you're doing in the world to really push nature-based solutions forward at all these different levels and all these different nodes. Such a delight to get to know you and connect with your world.
Thank you. And likewise, I really appreciate you having me here, and I really enjoyed the conversation.
Hey, Earthmate. How did that episode resonate? Did it stretch you, inspire you, or perhaps irk you? I'm here for it, so please reach out. Besides the socials, we have a community to practice with on our website, eartharchetypes.com, where more Earth archetypes can guide your path and become dear friends. A great place to start is the quiz to discover your type. Oh, and on your way, I'd love for you to hit the subscribe button. See you again soon.